The air in the Sterling Air Solstice Lounge at JFK was a carefully filtered blend of old money and new anxiety. It smelled of worn leather, cedarwood polish, and the faint metallic tang of ambition. Beatrice Thornton moved through this environment not as a passenger, but as a predator in her natural hunting ground. In her late 50s, she was a monument to sharp angles and expensive fabrics, her face a taut mask of aggressive wellness, her smile a blood-red incision that never threatened to reach her cold, assessing eyes. Her husband, Arthur, a man who seemed to be perpetually apologizing for the space he occupied, trailed in her wake, his focus glued to the stock ticker on his phone. Beatrice was the queen of Thornton Realty, a boutique firm that didn't just sell luxury penthouses. It sold narratives of power. She didn't build homes, she built fortresses for the elite, and she carried that same brutalist architecture in her soul. Today's performance was one of detached, transatlantic command. She was flying to London to personally terminate a partnership that had shown a moment's weakness, an act she considered both a duty and a pleasure. Her imperious survey of the lounge, a silent culling of the worthy from the unworthy, snagged on a jarring detail. In a wingback chair by the vast window overlooking the tarmac, a young woman sat, utterly absorbed. She was perhaps 22, dressed in a simple, well-tailored linen blazer, dark trousers, and understated leather loafers. Her attire wasn't cheap, but it was quiet, lacking the desperate roar of branding that Beatrice favored. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple, elegant knot, and in her lap was not a phone, but a heavy sketchbook. With a charcoal pencil, she was rendering the complex steel trusses of the lounge's ceiling with a precision that was both artistic and unnervingly technical. This was Alara Vance, and her quiet self-possession was, to Beatrice, a profound and immediate irritation. It was an unapproved frequency in her carefully tuned world. "Look at that," Beatrice murmured, her voice a low thrum of disdain, nodding towards Alara. "They're letting students in now? Probably a prize from some art school contest. It dilutes the brand." Arthur glanced up, his eyes briefly registering Alara before darting away as if the sight might burn him. "She's not bothering anyone, Bea." "That's not the point, Arthur," Beatrice hissed, her words sharp enough to chip stone. "Exclusivity is a fragile ecosystem. One invasive species, and the whole thing collapses. People pay for this atmosphere. They pay for the guarantee that they won't be confronted with earnestness." She watched as a lounge attendant offered Alara a glass of champagne. Alara looked up, her expression open and thoughtful, and gave a small, polite shake of her head. "Just sparkling water, please. Thank you." She smiled, a genuine, warm thing so alien in this room, and immediately returned to her drawing. The refusal, the lack of giddy, grateful acceptance of a perk she supposedly didn't deserve, was a fresh offense. To Beatrice, luxury was a religion, and this girl was a placid heretic, refusing to kneel. The boarding call for Sterling Air Flight 1 to London Heathrow was a soft, melodious chime. Beatrice gathered her things with the sharp, efficient movements of a hawk, ensuring her platinum carry-on, a brutalist block of brushed aluminum, was held at the perfect angle. She and Arthur were, of course, the first to the gate. Their seats 1A and 1B were cocoons of privacy and privilege at the very front of the first-class cabin. As Beatrice settled in, accepting a pre-departure glass of Bollinger from a flight attendant with a practiced smile, she felt a jolt of disbelief. The girl from the lounge was walking down the aisle. Beatrice watched, a cruel smirk touching her lips. She was certain the girl was disoriented, a lost lamb about to be gently herded back towards the bleeding masses in premium economy. But the girl didn't falter. She stopped, glanced at her boarding pass, then at the number above seat 1C, directly across the aisle. She slid her leather portfolio case under the seat in front of her and began to settle in. The smirk on Beatrice's face curdled into a mask of cold fury. Across the aisle. For 7 hours. It was an intolerable intrusion. She leaned into the aisle, her voice ringing with the authority of someone who had never been told no. "Excuse me, I believe you've made a mistake." Alara looked up, her dark, intelligent eyes showing mild surprise, not intimidation. "I'm sorry?" "This is the first-class cabin," Beatrice stated, enunciating each word as if speaking to a simpleton. Your seat must be in the rear of the aircraft. It's a common mistake. Alara's brow furrowed slightly. She held up her boarding pass, the seat assignment clear. 1C. No, I'm quite sure this is correct. Seat 1C. That's not possible, Beatrice snapped, the sound cracking like a whip in the hushed cabin. Marcus, the lead flight attendant, a man in his 40s with the calm demeanor of a seasoned diplomat, materialized at Beatrice's elbow. Is everything all right, Mrs. Thornton? He asked, his tone a perfect blend of deference and control. No, Marcus, it is not, Beatrice declared, gesturing with a dismissive flick of her hand toward Alara. This passenger is clearly in the wrong section. I insist you check her credentials. The airline must have made an error. Marcus turned his calm, professional gaze to Alara. May I see your pass, miss? Alara handed it to him. He scanned it with a small device. His pleasant expression remained unchanged. Everything is perfectly in order. Welcome aboard, Miss Vance. Seat 1C. May I get you a drink before takeoff? The same as before, please. Just sparkling water, Alara said, her voice even. She gave Marcus a small nod of thanks, then turned her attention to the window, effectively ending the conversation. Beatrice was left sputtering in her wake. A hot, ugly flush crept up her neck. This was more than just an annoyance. It was an act of defiance. The girl's composure was a silent judgment on Beatrice's own boorishness. She had been challenged by Beatrice Thornton, a titan of industry, a woman who could buy and sell entire city blocks, and she had not even blinked. The carefully orchestrated performance of her transatlantic power trip had been thrown into chaos, and Beatrice was already calculating how to rewrite the scene and reassert her dominance. Arthur, she seethed, her voice a venomous whisper. This is an outrage. I am paying a 5-figure sum for this ticket, for the privacy, for the standard, and they allowed this nobody to sit across from me. How did she even get this ticket? Arthur, sensing the escalating danger, finally lowered his phone. B, please, let it go. It's not our concern. It is precisely my concern, she retorted. My environment is my concern. My brand is my concern. Sterling Air promises a certain caliber of experience, and this is a breach of contract. She watched Alara in the reflection of her window. The girl was looking out at the ground crew, her gaze focused and analytical, as if memorizing the intricate choreography of the baggage handlers and fuel trucks. She was utterly unbothered by Beatrice, by the luxury cabin, by the bubbling champagne, and that, more than anything, was an unforgivable sin. The battle for the soul of first class had officially begun. The Rolls-Royce engines of the Boeing 777 spooled up, a sublime roar of controlled power that pressed the passengers back into their seats. As the aircraft clawed its way into the darkening sky, leaving the diamond dust sprawl of New York behind, Beatrice Thornton commenced her war of attrition. Her opening salvo was an act of calculated carelessness. As Marcus delivered Alara's sparkling water, Beatrice chose that exact moment to retrieve her purse from the floor. She shifted her body abruptly, jostling Marcus's arm just enough. A cascade of icy water splashed across the console and onto the corner of Alara's open sketchbook. "Oh my goodness!" Beatrice exclaimed, her voice a symphony of false concern. "How clumsy of me! I am so terribly sorry." Marcus immediately began dabbing at the mess with a napkin, apologizing profusely. "My apologies, Miss Vance. That was entirely my fault." "No, it wasn't," Alara said calmly, her eyes meeting Beatrice's for a fleeting second. There was no anger in them, only a clear, unnerving understanding. She took the napkin from Marcus. "It's fine. It's only water," and it missed the drawing. She carefully blotted the wet page, her movements precise and unhurried, before closing the sketchbook and placing it safely in her portfolio. She had acknowledged the attack, absorbed it, and neutralized it without a single raised word. Beatrice felt a prickle of fury. Round 1 was a draw, which in her world was a loss. Next, she targeted the senses. She unstoppered a small bottle from her purse containing a hideously expensive and potent perfume. It was a heavy, cloying scent, a floral assault designed to announce her presence and suffocate all other aromas. She dabbed it ostentatiously on her wrists and neck. The enclosed air of the cabin soon became thick with it. Across the aisle, Alara gave a small, almost imperceptible cough. She discreetly angled the personal air vent towards her face. She didn't complain. She didn't summon a flight attendant. She simply adapted. Another quiet act of resilience that only stoked Beatrice's rage. Sitting across the aisle in seat 2D, a man had been observing the escalating drama over the top of a well-worn copy of the Wall Street Journal. He was in his late 70s, with a shock of silver hair and eyes that had seen the rise and fall of corporate empires. He wore a simple but exquisitely tailored tweed jacket that looked as comfortable as pajamas. His name was Alistair Sterling, and he had made this flight more times than he could count. He saw Beatrice for exactly what she was, a tiresome cliché of new money arrogance, and he found the quiet girl's composure intriguing. The main event began with the dinner service. A 5-course tasting menu was offered, a culinary journey curated by a Michelin-starred chef. When Marcus arrived at Beatrice's seat, she began a long and tedious interrogation about the provenance of the seared scallops and the exact temperature of the wine pairing. When Marcus moved to Alara, she smiled politely. "It all looks wonderful, but could I possibly just have the grilled chicken from the business class menu, if it's not too much trouble, and I'll stick with the water?" Beatrice overheard and saw her opening. She laughed, a short, sharp bark devoid of humor. Her voice was now pitched for an audience. "My dear girl," she said, leaning into the aisle, "a word of advice. When someone offers you an experience like this, you take it. You don't ask for chicken. It tells people you don't belong. It's like going to the opera and asking them to play a pop song." The insult was so nakedly condescending that a hush fell over the front of the cabin. Arthur sank lower in his seat, his face a mottled red. Alistair Sterling slowly folded his newspaper and placed it on the empty seat beside him, his full attention now on the unfolding scene. Alara placed her napkin on her lap. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her water, then turned to face Beatrice. Her expression was not one of hurt or anger. It was one of calm academic curiosity, as if she were examining a particularly interesting but flawed specimen. "That's a fascinating perspective, Mrs. Thornton," she began, her voice soft, but carrying a surprising weight of authority. "You see my choice as a lack of sophistication. I see it as a matter of preparation. The tasting menu, with its rich sauces and multiple wine pairings, is designed to be a somnolent experience. It's meant to lull you into a comfortable digestive stupor for the remainder of the flight." She paused, letting the words settle. "I, on the other hand, have a 2-hour project review with a board of trustees at the British Architectural Library less than 3 hours after we land. A project I've been working on for 18 months. Simple protein and hydration are proven to be more conducive to mental acuity than a heavy, complex meal. My choice isn't about my palate, it's about my priorities." She gave a small, tight smile. "I suppose it comes down to what one is flying to London to do, to indulge or to work." The cabin was utterly silent. Alistair Sterling's lips twitched, fighting a smile. Marcus, who was standing by the galley, had to turn away to hide his expression. Beatrice's perfectly made-up face was a canvas of disbelief and incandescent rage. She had been intellectually outmaneuvered, her condescension reframed as frivolous self-indulgence. The art student had just subtly, devastatingly called her unprofessional. "Well," Beatrice sputtered, her voice tight with venom, What a very well-rehearsed and presumptuous little speech." "Not at all," Alara replied evenly. "It's just basic performance biology." She then turned back to Marcus. "The chicken would be wonderful, thank you." She had won the exchange decisively and elegantly, but in doing so, she had turned Beatrice's petty irritation into a homicidal fury. The war was no longer about establishing dominance. It was now about annihilation. Beatrice gripped the armrest of her seat, her knuckles white. She would not be dismissed. She would not be made to look like a fool. The flight was only half over, and she was already plotting a way to ensure that for Alara Vance, the landing in London would be a nightmare. The intellectual parry had done nothing to pacify Beatrice Thornton. It had merely armed her rage. For the next hour, she sat in a toxic, simmering silence, the cloying scent of her perfume a declaration of war. Arthur had retreated into a catatonic state, his phone a shield against the fallout he knew was coming. Beatrice's mind, a cruel and efficient machine, Processed and discarded tactics. Public shaming had failed. Intellectual jabs had backfired. All that remained was the bludgeon of pure, unadulterated power. She would create a crisis so profound, so undeniable, that the airline staff would have no choice but to validate her status by punishing the girl. She waited until Marcus was occupied at the other end of the cabin, then pressed her call button. A junior flight attendant, a young woman named Chloe with kind but nervous eyes, responded instantly. "Yes, Mrs. Thornton?" Beatrice's face was a mask of carefully constructed panic. "My purse," she said, her voice a strained whisper. "It was right here by my feet. I think my fountain pen is missing." She began to rummage through her bag with theatrical desperation. "It's a vintage Mont Blanc, a gift from my husband. It's invaluable." Chloe's eyes widened. "Ma'am, are you sure? Perhaps it just fell." "I am sure," Beatrice snapped, cutting her off. "I used it to make a note just before the meal service, and I put it right back in the side pocket. Now it's gone." Her eyes, cold and accusatory, darted across the aisle to Alara, who was sleeping peacefully, an eye mask on, her head tilted against the window. The implication was as subtle as a sledgehammer. Chloe looked flustered. A theft accusation in first class was a DEFCON 1 situation. "Let me get the lead flight attendant, ma'am." Marcus arrived moments later, his diplomatic face now etched with concern. Beatrice repeated her story, adding a new poisonous detail. "That girl," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "I saw her looking at my things earlier. She was admiring my bag. I didn't think anything of it at the time. But now—" Marcus looked from Beatrice's frantic performance to Alara's sleeping form. His internal compass, honed by years of dealing with difficult passengers, was screaming. Something was deeply wrong. "Mrs. Thornton, I'm sure there's a simple explanation," he said, trying to de-escalate. "If you'll allow me, perhaps we can have a more thorough look for it." "I've looked," Beatrice insisted, her voice rising. "It's been stolen. I want her things searched, and I want the authorities notified. I intend to press charges the moment we land." This was the nuclear option. Passengers across the cabin were now openly staring. Arthur looked physically ill. "B, for God's sake, it's a pen," he muttered. "It is not a pen, Arthur. It is a principle," she screeched. Protocol was protocol. Marcus knew he was being manipulated, but a direct accusation of theft could not be ignored. He walked across the aisle and gently touched Alara's shoulder. Miss Vance? Miss Vance, I'm so sorry to wake you." Alara stirred, pulling off her eye mask, blinking in the dim cabin light. "Is everything all right?" Marcus's discomfort was palpable. "Miss, I am terribly sorry to ask this, but the passenger in 1A has reported a valuable item missing from her purse. She seems to believe you may have seen it." Alara was now fully awake. She took in the scene, Beatrice's triumphant, predatory glare, Marcus's pained expression, the gawking passengers. She understood instantly. This was the endgame. "She's missing an item," Alara stated, her voice steady, "and she is accusing me of taking it." "She has made a suggestion," Marcus began, but Alara cut him off. "Let's not mince words, Marcus. She is accusing me of theft." Alara's gaze shifted to Beatrice. There was no fear in her eyes, only a profound, weary disappointment. "You are accusing me of stealing your pen." "It's missing, and you were the only one near me," Beatrice shot back. Alara held her hands up in a gesture of calm surrender. "Then by all means search my belongings. Search me if you need to. I have nothing to hide." The quiet dignity of her response was a stark contrast to Beatrice's shrill hysterics. Reluctantly, Marcus gestured for Chloe to join him. In full view of the other passengers, they conducted a careful, respectful search of Alara's carry-on and her portfolio. They found sketchbooks, charcoal pencils, a laptop, a change of clothes, and a book on structural engineering. There was no pen. "It appears it's not here, ma'am," Marcus said, turning back to Beatrice. "Of course not," Beatrice scoffed. "She's obviously hidden it on her person, or flushed it down the lavatory. She panicked." The situation was spiraling. Marcus was trapped. But then, Alara spoke, her voice cutting through the tension with the clarity of a bell. "Mrs. Thornton," she said, her eyes fixed on the older woman, "your pen isn't missing." "How dare you? You're a thief and a liar." "No," Alara continued, her voice gaining strength. "I am observant. When you first sat down, you took the pen out to sign a document your husband showed you on his tablet. After you signed, you didn't put it back in your purse. You clipped it into the inner pocket of your cashmere coat, the one folded in the overhead compartment above your seat. Beatrice froze, her face a storm of conflicting emotions. I remember it distinctly, Ilara went on, her memory for detail now her most powerful weapon. It was a silver Mont Blanc Meisterstück solitaire. The light from the window caught the engraving on the clip. You tucked it away and then Chloe offered you a drink, and you haven't touched your coat since. If you check your coat, you will find your pen. The entire cabin was wrapped. Ilara had not just denied the accusation, she had provided a verifiable, detailed account that shredded Beatrice's claim. The specificity was damning. Beatrice's face went white. She knew Ilara was right. In her rage-fueled quest for vengeance, she had forgotten that small, crucial detail. Before she could respond, a new voice entered the fray. It was quiet, but it carried the effortless weight of immense authority. Alistair Sterling, from seat 2D, had risen to his feet. "Marcus," he said, his eyes fixed on Beatrice with a look of profound disgust. "Please retrieve Mrs. Thornton's coat." Marcus, looking immensely relieved to have an instruction from someone other than Beatrice, quickly opened the overhead locker and handed the luxurious coat down to her. Beatrice's hands trembled as she fumbled with it. With everyone watching, she reached into the inner pocket. Her hand came out holding the silver fountain pen. A collective gasp went through the cabin, followed by a wave of angry murmurs. The businessman who had been publicly humiliated, lied about, and accused of being a thief had been utterly vindicated. Alistair Sterling took a step into the aisle. He wasn't looking at the pen. He was looking at Beatrice, and his expression was one of final judgment. "You, madam," he said, his voice low and trembling, with controlled anger, "are a disgrace, not just to this airline, but to the basic principles of human decency. You have harassed this young woman since we left New York. You have lied to the crew, and you have made a false accusation of a crime, an act that could have serious legal repercussions for an innocent person. You have abused the privilege of your ticket and the patience of everyone on this aircraft." He then turned to the stunned flight attendant. "Marcus, please inform Captain Evans that I will be meeting him on the jet bridge upon our arrival. Tell him Alistair Sterling requires a full security and corporate incident report to be filed regarding the conduct of Mrs. Beatrice Thornton. Immediately." Beatrice's jaw dropped. The name hung in the air, electric and terrifying. Sterling, as in sterling air. The truth dawned on her with the force of a physical blow. The quiet old man in the tweed jacket wasn't just another wealthy passenger. She had seen his portrait in the airline's annual reports, a younger version of him from decades ago. Alistair Sterling, the legendary reclusive founder of the airline, the man who had built the entire empire on a reputation for unparalleled service and integrity. She hadn't just picked a fight with a random girl. She had performed her most monstrous self in front of the one man who could utterly and completely destroy her. The crew wasn't just shaking with the stress of the incident anymore. They were shaking with the seismic shock of the revelation. Karma hadn't just landed on Flight 1. It had owned the plane all along. The descent into London Heathrow was conducted in a silence so thick it felt like a physical pressure. Beatrice Thornton sat rigid in her seat, a statue carved from ice, the silver pen lying on her tray table like an instrument of her own execution. The blood had drained from her face, leaving her expensive makeup to stand out in harsh, clownish relief. Her mind, usually a whirlwind of strategic calculations, was a blank void of horror. She replayed every sneer, every lie, every act of petty cruelty, all under the watchful, disappointed eyes of the man who owned the very air she was breathing. Alistair Sterling had returned to his seat and his newspaper, but he wasn't reading. He was a figure of immense potential energy, a dormant volcano that had briefly shown its fire and now waited to truly erupt. As the plane taxied to the gate, the captain's voice came over the intercom, clipped and formal. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived. We ask that all passengers please remain seated until the party in seats 1A and 1B have been escorted from the aircraft." The public nature of the announcement was a fresh, deep humiliation. Everyone knew. Everyone was watching. Arthur looked as if he might faint, his face the color of wet cement. The jet bridge connected, and the cabin door opened. Two uniformed airport police officers and a stern-faced woman in a Sterling Air corporate suit were waiting. They did not look at the other passengers. Their focus was entirely on Beatrice and Arthur. Alistair Sterling stood, and as he did, Marcus and the other flight attendants addressed him with a new, profound deference. "Mr. Sterling," Marcus said, "Captain Evans is waiting for you on the jet bridge." "Thank you, Marcus," Sterling said, his voice calm again. He paused as he reached Beatrice's seat. He didn't look at her. He looked at Alara, who was watching the scene with a quiet, somber expression. "Miss Vance," he said, and his voice was now warm, tinged with respect. "Your composure and integrity under extreme provocation were remarkable. My airline was founded on the principle that character is the ultimate currency. You have demonstrated it in abundance. And you," he added, his voice lowering, "draw with a remarkable eye for structural detail." He had noticed. He had seen her skill, not just her ordeal. He then turned his attention to Beatrice, and the warmth vanished, replaced by an Arctic chill. "Mrs. Thornton," he said, his voice a quiet blade, "you seem to have mistaken the price of your ticket for a license to be cruel. Let me be very clear. Sterling Air is not a vehicle for your ego. It is a business I built with my hands, my sweat, and my belief that people should be treated with dignity. You have violated every principle I hold dear." The corporate official stepped forward. "Mrs. Thornton, Mr. Thornton, my name is Elizabeth Cole from Sterling Air Corporate Affairs. We have been instructed to inform you that, due to your dangerous and disruptive behavior, which includes the willful harassment of another passenger and the leveling of a false criminal accusation, you are both being placed on the permanent global no-fly list for Sterling Air. The descent into London was a fall from a height far greater than 37,000 feet. It was a silent, terrifying plunge through the strata of a world Beatrice Thornton had meticulously constructed and ruled. The engines, which had once been a sublime chorus of her own power, were now a whining dirge counting down the seconds to her annihilation. She sat perfectly still, a sculpture of expensive terror, her eyes fixed on the silver Mont Blanc lying on the tray table. It wasn't an object anymore. It was a relic of a former life, a totem of the hubris that had undone her. The light from the window caught the engraving, just as Alara had described. The detail was obscene. It was the truth, made manifest in polished metal, and it was her accuser. Arthur, beside her, had shrunken into himself, a man trying to physically unexist. The air in their private cocoon, once thick with entitlement, was now a vacuum, suffocating them with the immense unspoken pressure of their public ruin. When the captain's voice crackled through the cabin, requesting that all passengers remain seated while the party in 1A and 1B were escorted off, the words were not a courtesy but a branding iron, searing their shame into the memory of every person on board. The click of the cabin door opening was the sound of a guillotine being released. The two uniformed officers and the woman in the severe corporate suit did not enter. They waited, their presence an impassable wall between Beatrice's world and the one she was about to be forcibly ejected into. Alistair Sterling rose first, moving with an unhurried grace that was in itself a condemnation. He paused, his gaze sweeping past Beatrice as if she were a piece of furniture, and settled on Alara. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice a low, warm current in the frozen atmosphere, "your composure and integrity under extreme provocation were remarkable. My airline was founded on the principle that character is the ultimate currency. You have demonstrated it in abundance. And you," he added, a glint of genuine appreciation in his eyes, "draw with a remarkable eye for structural detail." He nodded once, a gesture of profound respect, before turning his gaze finally to Beatrice. The warmth vanished, replaced by an Arctic chill. "Mrs. Thornton," he said, the words precise and devastating, "you seem to have mistaken the price of your ticket for a license to be cruel. Let me be very clear. Sterling Air is not a vehicle for your ego. It is a business I built with my hands, my sweat, and my belief that people should be treated with dignity. You have violated every principle I hold dear." The corporate official, Ms. Cole, stepped forward. Her voice was devoid of emotion, a clinical instrument of execution. Mrs. Thornton, Mr. Thornton, my name is Elizabeth Cole from Sterling Air Corporate Affairs. We have been instructed to inform you that, due to your dangerous and disruptive behavior, which includes the willful harassment of another passenger and the leveling of a false criminal accusation, you are both being placed on the permanent, global no-fly list for Sterling Air and all our Sky Connect Alliance partners. Arthur made a sound like a strangled sob. A global ban. It was more than an inconvenience. It was excommunication from their entire class. Your return tickets have been canceled without refund, Ms. Cole continued, each word a nail in their coffin. You will be escorted to a security facility where you will be interviewed regarding the false report you filed. Your actions will be logged with international flight safety databases. She paused, delivering the final blow. Mr. Sterling has also instructed our legal team to draft a civil complaint against you for defamation and endangerment on behalf of both Miss Vance and the airline. You will be served in due course. You can't, Beatrice whispered, the words small and broken. We have rights. Sterling, already at the door, turned his head slightly. A flicker of something that might have been pity, but was more likely weary disgust, crossed his features. Madam, you have responsibilities, and when you abdicate them so spectacularly, you forfeit your rights. You wanted to teach this young woman a lesson about her place in the world. Well, the world is about to teach you a lesson about yours. He disappeared onto the jet bridge. The officers stepped in. As they led Beatrice and Arthur down the aisle, through a gauntlet of silent, staring faces, Beatrice's gaze locked with Alara's one last time. There was no triumph in the young woman's eyes, no gloating satisfaction. There wasn't even pity. There was only a calm, profound, and unnerving neutrality. It was the look one gives to a collapsed retaining wall or a structural failure, a dispassionate observation of a thing that has succumbed to its own internal flaws. That look, more than the police, more than the public shame, was the true punishment. It confirmed she wasn't an adversary who had been defeated. She was simply a flaw in the design, an error to be removed so that something sound could be built in its place. The interrogation room at Heathrow was beige and featureless, an architectural void designed to strip visitors of identity. For hours, Beatrice and Arthur sat on uncomfortable chairs under the flat, merciless glare of fluorescent lights, answering questions from polite but implacable security officials. For Beatrice, the queen of meticulously curated spaces, this sterile anonymity was a unique form of torture. Here, her name meant nothing. Her wealth was irrelevant. She was simply the subject of an incident report. Arthur was the first to crack. He answered the questions in a monotone, his answers factual, devoid of the usual frantic attempts to placate her. When an official asked him directly, "Mr. Thornton, were you aware at any point that your wife's accusation was false?" There was a long, terrible silence. Beatrice shot him a look of pure venom. "Lie for me?" it commanded. "Fix this." But the man who had spent 3 decades apologizing for the space he occupied finally decided to claim it. He looked at the official, not at his wife. "I knew the pen was in her coat," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I saw her put it there." The world tilted. The betrayal was so absolute, so unexpected, that Beatrice couldn't even form a word of rage. He had not only failed to protect her, he had actively thrown her to the wolves. In that beige room, she finally understood that Arthur's fear of her had been replaced by something far more potent. His fear for himself. The brutal ecosystem she had created had finally turned on her. They were released in the early hours of the morning into the impersonal chaos of the arrivals hall. The Savoy had, via a chillingly polite email, informed them of an insurmountable plumbing catastrophe affecting their entire reserved wing, a lie so thin it was transparently an eviction. They took a taxi to a generic, soulless hotel near the airport, the kind of place Beatrice had only ever flown over. Inside the room, Arthur finally turned on her. There was no shouting, no drama, just the dead heavy finality of a collapsed structure. "It's over, B," he said, dropping his briefcase by the door. "All of it. "You pathetic coward," she hissed, her voice a ragged remnant of its former power. "You sold me out in there." "No," he said, looking at her as if for the first time. "I just stopped lying for you. I've been propping up this monstrous facade of yours for our entire marriage. I defended your cruelty. I absorbed your rage. I made your excuses. For what? So we could have apartments we never relax in and fly on planes where you wage war on innocent people?" He laughed, a dry, broken sound. "You know the saddest part? I wasn't even surprised. It was the most you thing you could have possibly done. You saw someone who had something you couldn't buy, a quiet sense of self, and you had to try and destroy it. It's your only move." He picked up his briefcase. "This partnership, the business, this marriage, it's dissolved. My lawyers will be in touch with yours, if you even have any left who will take your calls by the end of the week." He walked out, leaving the door ajar. Beatrice stood alone in the anonymous room, the hum of the mini fridge the only sound. She was surrounded by the evidence of her new life: cheap polyester curtains, a laminated room service menu, and the faint, lingering smell of disinfectant. She had been stripped not just of her power, but of her very context. She wasn't Beatrice Thornton, titan of industry anymore. She was just a woman in a hotel room, a ghost who had yet to realize she was dead. Alara Vance did not feel victorious. As she took the Heathrow Express into London, the city lights smearing past the window, she felt a profound sense of dislocation. The incident on the plane replayed in her mind not as a drama, but as a series of technical problems. Beatrice was a stress test, a catastrophic load applied to the system. And the system, in the form of Alistair Sterling and the crew, had held. But the experience had left behind a fine layer of dust, a residue of human ugliness that she couldn't simply wipe away. She went to the British Architectural Library the next day, as planned. She delivered her presentation on the structural and social dynamics of transient spaces. Her voice was steady, her points were sharp, but she felt a strange new variable in her own carefully constructed equations. She spoke of how airports and stations should be designed for dignity, for calm, for intuitive human flow. The words had a new weight, a new urgency. She was no longer just a theorist. She had been a field operative on the front lines of public incivility. A month later, back in New York, the letter from the Sterling Foundation arrived. It was not, as she might have expected, a formal offer. It was an invitation. "Miss Vance," it read in a strong, decisive hand, "I find myself often thinking about our brief shared experience. I would be honored if you would join me for a conversation. I am keen to hear more of your thoughts on the soul of a building." She met him in a quiet corner of the restored TWA Hotel at JFK, a masterpiece of mid-century design that Sterling himself had helped fund. He was dressed in the same comfortable tweed, looking more like a university professor than a billionaire tycoon. They didn't speak of Beatrice Thornton. They spoke of Eero Saarinen's soaring concrete curves. They discussed the way light fell in Grand Central Station, the psychological effect of ceiling height, the subtle language of materials. He listened, truly listened, as she spoke passionately about her thesis. That modern infrastructure had prioritized efficiency over humanity, creating spaces that process people instead of welcoming them. "You see the bones of things, Miss Vance," he said, finally stirring his tea. "It's a rare gift. Most people just see the surface, the brands, the price tags." He looked out at the iconic terminal. "I built an airline, but I never truly built it a home. This terminal, it has history, but it has no heart. It's aging. We need to renovate it, to bring it into this century without losing its soul. It's a problem of structural integrity, both literal and metaphorical." He leaned forward, his eyes keen. "I'm creating a fellowship, the Sterling Fellowship for Architectural Heritage in Public Spaces. Its first project will be to lead the redesign of this terminal, to create a space that embodies the principles my airline was supposed to stand for, a place where dignity is part of the design. I want you to be the first fellow." Alara felt a slow, rising tide of emotion that was deeper than gratitude. It wasn't a reward. It wasn't a prize for enduring humiliation. It was a recognition. He hadn't seen a victim on that plane. He had seen a peer, someone whose values and vision aligned with his own. He was giving her a chance not to get revenge, but to build the solution. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, Mr. Sterling, I would be honored." 6 months later, Beatrice Thornton stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of her Manhattan penthouse. The view, once a symbol of her dominion over the city, was now a panorama of her exclusion. The city pulsed with life, with deals being made, with buildings rising, all of it happening without her. Her empire had been dismantled, sold for parts to cover debts and lawsuits. Arthur was gone, having settled for a pittance just to be free of her. Her name, once whispered with fear and envy, was now a cautionary tale told in the boardrooms she could no longer enter. The phone never rang. The silence in the vast apartment was an active, malevolent presence. She was reduced to the one thing she had never been, an observer. She saw an article in an architecture journal about the ambitious new JFK renovation, led by a brilliant young architect named Ilara Vance. The article included a picture of Ilara on the construction site, hard hat on, pointing at a blueprint, her face alive with purpose. A wave of something hot and acidic rose in Beatrice's throat. It was the old, familiar rage, but it had no power now. It was a fire with no fuel. She had tried to extinguish that quiet light in Ilara, and in doing so, had only revealed how small and dark her own world was. The girl hadn't fought back. She had simply endured, and her endurance had been more powerful than all of Beatrice's aggression. She walked to the immense gilt mirror in her hallway, a mirror that had always reflected a queen. She looked for that woman now, the predator in the sharp suit, but she was gone. Staring back was a stranger, a woman in her late 50s, her face a mask of taut, expensive emptiness. Her eyes, which had once assessed and dismissed the world, were now filled with a terrifying, hollow clarity. The true bankruptcy had never been financial. It was the slow, horrifying realization that her entire life had been built on a false foundation. She had believed power was control, that worth was measured in dominance. She had spent a lifetime building fortresses only to find herself a prisoner in the last one, utterly alone. The world hadn't turned away from her because of one ugly incident on an airplane. The incident had merely been the crack that showed everyone the rot that had been there all along. The ultimate karma was not poverty or irrelevance. It was this. It was this moment in this silent apartment, with this stranger in the mirror, finally understanding that she had built nothing at all. 1 year after the flight, the main hall of Sterling Air's flagship terminal was a cavern of controlled creation. The old tired flooring was gone, replaced by polished terrazzo that echoed the building's original Art Deco glamour. Above, scaffolding crisscrossed the vaulted ceiling, where artisans were restoring intricate moldings. At the center of it all stood Ilara Vance. She was no longer the quiet girl in the lounge chair. She was the axis around which this entire massive project turned. She moved with an easy authority, discussing load-bearing calculations with engineers one moment and the precise hue of a custom mixed paint with designers the next. Alistair Sterling stood on a balcony overlooking the site, watching her. He came by once a week, not to supervise, but simply to observe. He saw the way the crew respected her, not out of fear, but because her vision was clear and her reasoning was sound. Ilara saw him and came up to join him, handing him a hard hat. "The original steel trusses you were sketching that day," he said, gesturing toward the newly exposed ceiling. "They're magnificent, aren't they?" "They're the soul of the building," she replied, her gaze full of reverence. "Everything else is just the skin. My job is to make sure the new skin is worthy of the bones." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the controlled chaos below. "I often wonder," Alistair mused, his voice low, "what would have happened if I hadn't been on that flight?" Ilara looked away from the construction and met his eyes. Her expression was thoughtful, devoid of sentimentality. What happened to Mrs. Thornton would have happened eventually. A structure with a flawed foundation will always fail. It's just a matter of when. As for me, she gave a small, confident smile, I would have gotten here eventually, perhaps by a different route, but good design always finds a way to be built. He smiled, a deep, genuine smile of understanding. She was right. He hadn't saved her. He had simply been a witness to a strength that was already there, a strength as clear and undeniable as the elegant lines of a steel truss holding up the sky. He had merely opened a door, and she had walked through it as if she had owned the building all along. From this height, on the balcony overlooking her creation, Ilara could see the whole design, a place of light, of intuitive pathways, of quiet corners for rest, a space built not just for passage, but for people. It was an answer, rendered in concrete and steel and glass, to the ugliness she had witnessed at 37,000 feet. She hadn't just won, she had remade the world in her own image, calm, considered, and built on a foundation of unshakable integrity.